Elden Ring introduced to the world a rich and detailed universe, a world that invites deep analysis. This raises a key question. What was the world of Elden Ring like before its destruction? What was it like to live in the lands between? In today's video, I'm going to explore the historical foundations of Marika's empire and the society of the lands between, working from the idea that before the Shattering, there existed a living, breathing world, a universe created, at least in its foundations, by the imagination of George R.R. Martin. So, let's begin a journey into the social history of the lands between. Before the war, before the fall, the lands between flourished. But what kind of world was it? The idea for this video came to me when I was studying the map of the lands between and noticed two fishermen on the edge of the world map, sitting quietly in the ocean waters. Naturally, they were fishing. But what caught my attention was this. If something so simple and peaceful exists there, it suggests that there was once life in the lands between. There was once a cohesive society living in peace before the Shattering. And with this observation, combined with my background as a historian, I decided to write about the society during Marika's era, touching on the religious, cultural, political, and economic aspects of life at that time. After all, we might soon have the opportunity to explore this world through that upcoming A24 Elden Ring movie. There's a real possibility that the film will take place before the Shattering, as a way of laying the groundwork for a broader movie franchise. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first point I want to make is that Elden Ring draws heavy inspiration from Western history, more specifically from medieval Europe. This influence is particularly noticeable because George R.R. Martin, a well-known enthusiast of medieval history, was involved in its creation. But beyond that, the medieval aspects are everywhere. The Golden Order bears numerous similarities to the Catholic Church, which spread Christian faith throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. The lands between is built on a rigid hierarchy that mirrors medieval society with knights, nobles, and peasants, which confine to their roles. The design of clothing, castles, and the use of archaic English also contribute to this medieval atmosphere. If we imagine the lands between as a fully functioning fantasy world, what would daily life have been like before everything fell apart? Between the beginning of Marika's reign and the Shattering, which marks the start of the game, we can assume that centuries passed. Centuries of prosperity and stability for this structure that resembles a powerful empire. The first point to consider is that Marika, as queen, ruled over a realm with feudal elements. And what does that mean? It means that even though Marika likely centralized much of the power, her government still relied on lesser kingdoms ruled by their respective lords. Evidence of this lies in the Carian family, which controlled Liurnia of the Lakes, and Lingrave, governed by the ruler of Stormveil Castle. Caelid, for example, is home to the massive Redmane Castle, now remembered for housing Radahn's forces, but there's reason to believe that before the Shattering and the spread of the Scarlet Rot, Caelid might have its own ruling family. Perhaps even the leaders of Celia. We know little about this dissident faction of Raya Lucaria, who knows? One key historical moment that shows Marika understood the importance of keeping her vassals close and limiting the power of rival royalty was the Liurnian Wars. These wars, which broke out at the start of Marika's reign, resulted in the Carians being subjugated by the power of the Erdtree through the marriage of Radagon and Renala. I think it's important to make one observation here. The lands between follow a medieval structure, but Marika's politics are highly centralized. This is an interesting difference from the real medieval world, which was famously marked by the decentralization of kings and the rise of independent realms. Now that I explain a bit about this basic medieval influence, I want to talk a little more about how society in the lands between was structured. Much like under feudalism, the society was divided between nobility, clergy, and peasantry. The division between nobility and clergy, however, is less clear-cut, as the Golden Order held both religious and political power, operating almost as a theocratic government. In other words, they represent both nobility and clergy within a single structure. Still, it's obvious there was a clear boundary between those who ruled and those who served, with each group fulfilling its specific roles and duties. In the medieval world, nobility was defined not only by birthright, but by land ownership, with land being worked by peasants. Nobility also drew its power from its military vocation. According to the historian Mark Bloch, this power was only possible through the command of other men. It became common then for nobles to engage in expeditions to other regions or wars against distant lords. Daily life easily sank into a grey monotony. Thus was born a hunger for entertainment which, when their own lands failed to offer enough, sought fulfillment in distant territories. The nobility of the lands between behaves in much the same way. Its upper echelons were part of the Golden Order and likely made up the core of Marika's military power. We know, for example, that each and every Fire Knight, a vital part of Mesmer's army, hail from a renowned family of the Erdtree's upper echelons, but were shunned and chased from their homes after pledging alliance to Mesmer as their master. War was an essential part of Marika's rule. She waged bloody conflicts against the Fire Giants, the Glowing-Eye Queen, the Horned Sands, the Dragons. Again, in the words of Bloch, for the nobility, war was a path to prestige, a way of proving their power to take what they desired. Has there ever been a more certain sign of prestige than the ability to say, "I want this"? The issue of knighthood is another clear sign that this society was organized through rigid social divisions. Not just anyone could become a knight. In fact, we encounter far fewer knights throughout the game than ordinary soldiers. Fire Knights, Cuckoo Knights, Black Knights, Knights Cavalry, Cleanrot Knights, and I won't even mention the Crucible Knights here, as they already earned their own dedicated video. The Order of Knights embodies what it meant to be noble in the society, just as it did in the Middle Ages. Only nobles fought on horseback, wore heavy helms, carried lances or swords, and bore the distinctive metallic armor of their class. What distinguished the highest class of warriors was the union of horse and full armor. And what about the largest social group, the peasants? Much like in the Middle Ages, this group consisted of the forgotten, those who struggled to survive after the Shattering. We encounter very few civilians in the game. Those we do find are the survivor merchants, who can truly be considered peasants, as well as soldiers and a few mercenaries. The vast majority of this class likely perished in the endless wars after the Shattering, which, although we don't know exactly how long, may have lasted centuries. In any case, society in the lands between was strictly divided. At the top were Marika and her demigod offspring, followed by the noble houses and their military force of knights. Below then were the peasants, from serfs working the lands to merchant, artisans such as the one who crafted the statue of Radagon, and ordinary commoners. And since we are talking about medieval society, I'd like to briefly mention how the social organization of the lands between also resembles this historical period, with scattered villages, field ravaged by war, and a single true city, Lando, the capital. The Middle Ages, at least in its earlier phase, which lasted until roughly the year 1000, was divided into fiefdoms, each with its own kind of capital within the kingdom. Power was decentralized within these territories, and cities only began to develop more notably after the 10th century, with this expansion of trade between states. In this regard, I believe Lando and the lands between resemble far more the structure found in fantasy universes, like The Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire. Micropowers orbiting a single capital, whether Gondor or the King's Landing, which represented the true seat of power for the territory. The villages we encounter are little more than ruins, with a few exceptions like Dominula Village and the Albinaurics Village. In my view, nearly all locations labeled ruins likely served as habitations for people destroyed by centuries of conflict. In some cases, it's clear there was once a well-organized town, such as Celia or the outskirts of Raya Lucaria. Naturally, we shouldn't forget that a large portion of the population live within the walls of Lendil, the safest place in this fantasy universe. After all, what threat could possibly break through its might defenses? In the field of historical studies, there's a discipline called microhistory, which focuses on studying in detail the daily lives of people in a given society, how people practice their culture on a daily basis. The goal is to capture the essence of a society, the social relationships, and how culture was organized. And that's exactly how I started thinking about the lands between. Could this world be viewed as normal? What was daily life like for its people? During the age of the Erdtree, and more precisely, during the Age of Plenty, the society reached its peak of splendor and beauty. Marika's realm was renowned for its prosperity under the blessing of the Erdtree. In such a favorable setting, it is clear that wealth was part of all aspects of life, whether economic or culture. I will leave the economic side for the next chapter, but for now, what about culture? First, it is important to clarify what we mean by culture, a complex term that defies simple definition. According to the historian Peter Burke, culture consists of the heritage, ideas, habits, and values that shapes a society. For the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, culture is a historically transmitted pattern of meanings embodied in symbols, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which people communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes towards life. When I think about a society like that of the lands between, it becomes clear how deeply culture and religion were intertwined. Daily actions were performed under the authority of the Erdtree and the Golden Order. Symbols, habits, and values were closely aligned with those perpetuated by the Golden Order. It's easy to imagine the population praying in the many churches scattered across the land. This isn't so different from medieval Europe, where society increasingly organized its daily life around the church. Farming, rest, festivities, everything revolved around holy days and moments dedicated to prayer and devotion. The symbolism of the Golden Order strongly echoes medieval Christianity, not only through its political and cultural power, but also in how this power grew in ways reminiscent of the Church's rise throughout Middle Ages. For example, it's interesting to observe that as the Erdtree became less a force of nature and more an object of faith for Marika, the Golden Order grew stronger. The description of the Blessed Dew talisman states, "It was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its bough forever, but that age of plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time, the Erdtree became more an object of faith." The idea of a government legitimized by faith was also present in medieval times, along with the notion that the dominant faith should subjugate all local beliefs. We can observe this clearly in the Golden Order's tactics of persecution and eradication against anything opposing their beliefs, such as the banishment and extermination of all things related to the Crucible, which led to the imprisonment and execution of the omens and the misbegotten. I discussed this further in my video relating Foucault's theories to Elden Ring. Furthermore, the Golden Order's obsession with purity and divine right closely resembles how medieval Christian doctrine placed kings and popes at the top of a sacred hierarchy, chosen directly by God. Just as European rulers claimed their power through the so-called divine right of kings, Marika's authority is absolute because she embodies the will of the greater will itself. These are just a few of the many similarities between these two institutions, both using faith and divine authority as tools to justify their expanding political influence over the daily lives of the population. With all this in mind, it becomes clear that the Golden Order and Marika would create this dominant and traditional culture in the lands between. However, there were other traditions and customs that deviated from the norm, as we can see in the contrasted examples of Dominula and Raya Lucaria. Dominula village, I have already spoken a bit about it in my video on Marika, feels like a pagan remnant lost in a Christianized world. Why does this village exist with its strange customs and such a distinct culture from the rest of the lands between? If we look again at medieval history and the spread of Christianity, this practice wasn't entirely uncommon. The church often allowed peasants to maintain certain pagan festivals at specific times to make assimilation into the faith less violent. Then, we have Raia Lucaria and the Carian royal family, who represent the classic case of descenders, social groups unwilling to accept the traditions and customs of their time. Yet, they needed to maintain their political power, even without accepting the Age of Plenty. Hence, war became a tool for political unification through marriage. Though pacified by Marika, Raia Lucaria remain a place that continued to practice everything the Golden Order would despise. As I mentioned earlier, the golden age of Marika's reign became known as the Age of Plenty. This choice of name is interesting because beyond being an era of splendor and the blessing of the Erdtree, it was also a time of economic wealth. No society can survive without an economy, without agriculture, fishing, and trade. As I said at the beginning of this video, the inspiration for this script came from noticing two fishermen on the edge of the lands between map, and from imagining the possibility of ordinary life happening there, with ordinary people living out their days before the world collapsed with the Shattering. When we think about the economy, it's almost impossible not to recall the nomadic merchants, a tribe tied to the Great Caravan, now suffering total annihilation after their possible involvement with the Frenzy Flame and their heretical beliefs. Everything that opposed the Golden Order, regardless of whether this guild had contact with an outer god or not, the fact remains, they must have been important to this society. Important, yes, but still excluded. Why do I say that? Because only a group seen as inferior could suffer complete annihilation and erasure from history without provoking any revolt or leaving a meaningful mark on society. It's curious to note that the nomadic merchants in the game files were labeled as Red-Eye Gypsy. And why is this relevant? Gypsy is a term, though outdated and often misused, used to describe the Romani people, a nomadic community present in many parts of the world, but especially in Bulgaria, Hungary, and Serbia. I won't dive too deeply into their history because it's not my area of expertise, and it would be disrespectful to speak on something I don't fully understand. What is important to note is that many Romani people were enslaved during the Middle Ages and also suffered persecution at the hands of nobles and the church. So, it is impossible not to draw a parallel between the Romani condition and the outcast, nomadic existence of the Great Caravan. It is a sad reflection and a reminder that Marika and the Golden Order were extreme when it comes to so-called heretical beliefs. Naturally, all this wealth and prosperity could only give rise to a powerful and fierce government ruled by Marika, a god. And here, I think it's important to make an observation. The fact that Marika ruled a centralized theocracy, where religion was inseparable from political decisions, is for me the key distinction between the lands between and our own medieval world. This characteristic wasn't present in the early Middle Ages because after the fragmentation of the powerful Roman Empire, centralized authority was weak, and most Europe splintered into various emerging kingdoms. Still, Marika's rule resembled that of a powerful empire, one that expanded through violence and domination, crushing those who did not align with its views. Just look at what happened to the fire giants, the horned sands, and everything related to the crucible. What Marika enforced was domination through war and violence, what we call hard politics, the kind of politics that relies on war and military force, in opposition to soft power, which revolves around diplomacy and cultural influence. A good example of hard politics would be the United States and Soviet Union after the World War II. It is obvious that the Golden Order's power was anything but soft, as it persecuted and destroyed everything that contradicted its beliefs. whether the Hornstands, the Misbegotten, the Albinautics, or the Omens. Marika treated war as a necessary reality for expanding her power, as she was aided by her powerful consort, Godfrey. By conquering entire civilizations, the Golden Order flourished and expanded. And when thinking about Night Rain, it's hard not to imagine that the universe of Lingveld could have been part of Marika's great empire at some point, even though distant enough to eventually break ties with the influence of the Golden Order more easily. But of course, that's just speculation. Despite all the violence and oppression, there was still a cohesive society. There was life and even progress. As Melina herself says when trying to warn the Tarnished against seeking the Three Fingers.
However ruined this world has become, however mired in torment and despair, life endures. Births continue. There is beauty in that, is there not?
Even if it wasn't golden and free from crime, and even if Marika was ruthless to her enemies, I like to think that this world was real, with its villages, trade, medieval knights, and religious devotion. And thinking about that gives me a bit of hope that the A24 film might explore these possibilities, rather than focus solely on the Shattering, because the universe of Elden Ring is vast and has the potential to inspire incredible stories. If you enjoy this kind of content, where I explore the intersection of video game lore, history, and literature, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Until next time, bye!